Take a polar bear and a grizzly bear and put their DNA side by side. What you get is not the comparison between two clearly separate animals that you might expect. What you get looks more like a comparison between two populations of the same animal that happen to live in very different places. The genetic difference between a polar bear and a brown bear is smaller than the genetic difference between some brown bear populations that live on opposite sides of the same mountain range. That was one of the things that came out when scientists collected DNA from all 8 bear species alive on Earth today and compared them. The results changed how researchers understand what a species actually is, how recently some of these animals split apart, and what is going to happen in the Arctic as the climate continues to shift. There are 8 bear species: the brown bear, which includes grizzlies, the polar bear, the giant panda, the American black bear, the Asiatic black bear, the sun bear, the sloth bear, and the spectacled bear of South America. They live on 5 continents, range from the tropics to the Arctic. Eat everything from bamboo to seals and look nothing alike. The question the DNA comparison was asking was simple. How closely are these animals actually related? And when did each of them become a separate thing? The answer started about 20 million years ago in Asia. Before getting to the results, it is worth understanding what the comparison actually involved. Collecting DNA from 8 bear species sounds straightforward. In practice, it meant working with tissue samples, blood samples, hair follicles, and in some cases, ancient bones from museum collections. Researchers compared both the mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down through the mother, and the nuclear DNA, which comes from both parents and gives a more complete picture of a species' history. The two types of DNA sometimes told slightly different stories, which itself turned out to be informative. When mitochondrial DNA and nuclear DNA disagree about how two animals are related, it usually means the two populations have been mixing across species lines at some point in their history. For bears, that mismatch kept appearing. The ancestor of all living bears was a medium-sized carnivore that lived somewhere in what is now China or the surrounding region. It was not yet a bear in the way we think of bears today. It was smaller, probably ate more meat than plant material, and lived in forested environments. But its DNA is the source material that, over the following 20 million years, would split and diversify and spread across the entire northern hemisphere and eventually into South America. The first split was the most dramatic, and it produced the most surprising result of the whole comparison. The giant panda branched off from the rest of the bear family roughly 19 million years ago. That is not a small number. To put it in context, the entire genus Homo, the group that includes all human species, is only about 2 to 3 million years old. The panda has been doing its own thing, completely separate from every other bear, for almost 10 times longer than humans have existed as a group. When the panda lineage split off, the ancestors of polar bears, grizzlies, and all the other bears were still a single, undivided population in Asia. The panda's isolation shows up in everything about it. It eats almost exclusively bamboo, which no other bear does. It has a modified wrist bone that works like a thumb for gripping bamboo stalks, which no other bear has. Its skull is shaped differently, its digestive system is different, and its behavior is different. These are not recent adaptations. They are the product of 19 million years of evolution on a completely separate path. The panda looks like a bear, and it is a bear, But it is a bear the way a platypus is a mammal. Technically correct, but separated from the rest by an enormous gulf of independent evolutionary history. After the panda split, the rest of the bear family continued to diversify. The spectacled bear lineage separated next and headed into South America, making it the only surviving member of an ancient American bear group that once included animals much larger than anything alive today. Then came the sun bear of Southeast Asia, the smallest of the living bears, followed by the sloth bear of South Asia and the Asiatic black bear. What the DNA comparison showed about these species was that their relationships did not always match what researchers had assumed from looking at them. The sloth bear, which hangs upside down from branches and eats insects, looks behaviorally more like a sun bear than like a brown bear, but the DNA placed it closer to the polar bear lineage than to the sun bear. Appearance and behavior, again, turned out to be an unreliable guide to what the genome was actually saying. The American black bear, which is the most common bear in North America, came out in the DNA comparison as more closely related to the polar bear and brown bear than to the spectacled bear, despite living on the same continent as the spectacled bear's ancestors for millions of years. Geographic proximity turns out to mean very little once you look at the genome. The black bear split from the polar and brown bear lineage roughly 6 million years ago, which makes it a significantly older and more distinct lineage than the polar bear itself. Then came the brown bear and the polar bear. And the result that nobody quite expected. Brown bears spread across a huge range. They live in North America as grizzlies and Kodiak bears, across Russia and Scandinavia as European brown bears, and through parts of Central Asia and the Middle East. Across that range, different brown bear populations have been separated by mountains, rivers, and ice ages for tens of thousands of years, and they have accumulated real genetic differences. Some brown bear populations in Russia are more genetically distinct from some North American brown bear populations than those North American brown bears are from polar bears. The polar bear, by the standard genetic measures used to define species, sits inside the brown bear family tree rather than outside it. The two animals share a common ancestor that lived somewhere between 150,000 and 500,000 years ago, a relatively recent split by evolutionary standards. What happened after that split was not a gradual drift apart, but a rapid specialization. The polar bear ancestor moved into Arctic environments and, in a short period of evolutionary time, developed white fur, a streamlined body shape for swimming, enormous fat reserves, a metabolism that can process the high-fat diet of seals, and paws designed for walking on ice. All of those changes happened fast. The DNA change underneath them was comparatively small. The speed of the polar bear's physical transformation is one of the more striking findings. Researchers looking at which parts of the polar bear genome changed most rapidly after the split from brown bears found signatures of fast evolution in genes related to fat processing, heart function, and skin and hair pigmentation. The polar bear did not gradually turn white over millions of years. It acquired white fur relatively quickly, probably because camouflage on ice was immediately advantageous for hunting seals. Its internal changes, the ability to eat a diet that is almost entirely fat and protein without the cardiovascular problems that would kill most other mammals, appear to have followed a similar pattern of fast adaptation under strong selective pressure. The clearest evidence for how close the two species remain came from 3 small islands off the coast of Alaska: Admiralty, Baranof, and Chichagof, known together as the ABC Islands. These islands are home to a population of brown bears. When researchers sequenced their DNA, they found something unexpected. The ABC Islands brown bears carry significant amounts of polar bear DNA in their genomes, more than brown bears from anywhere else. The most likely explanation is that these bears are descended from an ancient population of polar bears that became stranded on the islands during a warm period when Arctic ice retreated, interbred with arriving brown bears over many generations, and eventually became physically brown bears again while retaining the polar bear DNA in their genomes. The islands are a record of something that happened thousands of years ago. What is happening right now in the Canadian Arctic is a more current version of the same story. As temperatures in the Arctic have risen, grizzly bears have been moving further north than they historically went. Their range now overlaps with polar bear territory in ways it did not a few decades ago. Where the two species encounter each other, they sometimes mate. The offspring, called grizzly bears or growler bears, depending on which parent was which, are not sterile. They are fertile and have themselves produced offspring with both polar bears and grizzlies. DNA testing of unusual-looking bears shot by hunters in northern Canada has confirmed multiple generations of hybridization. The hybrid is a real, reproducing animal, not just a curiosity. What the hybrids actually look like varies. Some are almost white with a slight yellowish tinge. Some have the brown patches and grizzly hump mixed in with pale fur. Some look almost like a standard grizzly. Their behavior also varies. They seem to fall somewhere between their parents in terms of what they eat and how they hunt. Whether the hybrid will become more common as Arctic conditions change is something researchers are actively watching. The question researchers are now asking is whether hybridization will eventually blur the boundary between grizzlies and polar bears at a population level, or whether it will remain a marginal phenomenon in the areas where their ranges currently overlap. The answer depends partly on how quickly Arctic sea ice continues to decline. Polar bears hunt primarily from sea ice. They wait at breathing holes for seals to surface, and they travel enormous distances across frozen ocean in search of prey. As ice seasons shorten, polar bears spend more time on land, in exactly the areas where grizzlies are also moving north. More contact means more opportunity for hybridization. Some researchers have suggested that if conditions change fast enough, what currently looks like two species with occasional interbreeding could eventually become one highly variable population occupying a range from the boreal forest to the high Arctic. Back at the other end of the bear family tree, the spectacled bear of South America sits alone on its branch as the last survivor of a group that was once much larger. The short-faced bears, giant animals that lived across North and South America until the end of the last ice age, were part of the same lineage. The largest of them, Arctodus simus, was probably the biggest land carnivore to ever live in the Americas, standing nearly 2 meters at the shoulder. The DNA comparison showed that the spectacled bear, which is much smaller and eats mostly fruit and cactus in the Andes Mountains, is the sole living representative of that entire group. Everything else in it went extinct. The sun bear, meanwhile, occupies a position in the family tree that makes it one of the least studied bears in terms of genetics. It is the smallest living bear, living in the rainforests of Southeast Asia, and it turned out to carry DNA signatures suggesting that its population has been small and isolated for a very long time. It shows lower genetic diversity than most other bear species, not because it had a recent population crash, but because the forests it depends on have been fragmenting for millions of years, keeping populations separated and reducing the mixing that generates genetic variation. What the complete DNA comparison of all 8 bear species produced was not the clean family tree that anyone expected. It was messier than that. A picture of a group of animals that have been splitting apart and coming back together, hybridizing across species lines at different points in history, carrying DNA from relatives that lived thousands of years ago in places they no longer inhabit. One more finding from the comparison is worth noting. When researchers looked at which bear species had the lowest genetic diversity, the least variation in their DNA across the population, the giant panda came out near the bottom. This is partly a consequence of its 19 million year isolation, and partly a consequence of its recent population decline from habitat loss. The panda has been on its own branch so long, and that branch has been under so much pressure that the surviving population carries relatively little variation. That makes the species more vulnerable to disease and less able to adapt quickly to environmental changes. The panda's genetic isolation, which started as a simple evolutionary split, has become an additional conservation problem layered on top of all the others. The polar bear is the sharpest example. It is not a species that gradually drifted away from brown bears over tens of millions of years. It is a brown bear that made a very fast set of physical changes in response to a very specific environment, and then started coming back into contact with the animals it came from. The DNA never fully separated. Whether the polar bear remains a distinct animal going forward depends less on its genome than on whether the ice it depends on continues to exist. The giant panda, at the other end of the comparison, is the opposite story. It has been separate for so long and changed so thoroughly in that time that it now occupies a category of its own. A bear that barely resembles what bears started as, surviving on a diet that no other carnivore on Earth has adopted, in a mountain ecosystem where nothing else quite fills the same role. The sloth bear deserves a mention here because it produced one of the more counterintuitive results in the comparison. Sloth bears live in India and Sri Lanka, hang from trees, and eat termites and honey using a specially shaped mouth that works almost like a vacuum. They look and behave nothing like polar bears. But the DNA comparison placed the sloth bear closer to the polar bear and brown bear lineage than to the sun bear, despite the sun bear being geographically much closer. The shape of an animal, it turns out, is almost entirely the product of what that animal needs to survive in its specific environment. The underlying DNA can tell a completely different story about where the animal actually came from. 8 species, 1 comparison, and a family tree that keeps rewriting itself every time someone adds more data.